In the last lecture, we discussed the making of the Constitution. Now, if you remember, the Constitutional Convention, the 55 delegates that showed up, the majority of them were from the nationalist camp. So it is of no surprise that the ultimate product that came out of that Constitutional Convention in Independence Hall in Philadelphia was of the nationalist perspective, meaning a strong centralized government. But it's one thing for 55 delegates, not even that many as we'll talk about today, but nonetheless 55 delegates to come together, meet, and agree on a constitution as was produced in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's another thing entirely for the people themselves of this nation of the United States to come together and ratify that constitution. And that is a story we are going to tell in today's lecture, the ratification, the people debate the Constitution. And one of the first things we're going to see in this lecture is the fact that the fate of this Constitution was extremely uncertain. But nonetheless, despite this uncertainty, the Federalists were sneaky, maybe that's the wrong word, but they were smart enough to create certain mechanisms that benefited them and ultimately helped in the ratification. But in the process of these ratification debates that take place over the course of the time that we're going to be spending on this lecture, we will see that America splits apart into two camps, the Federalists and the AntiFederalists. And this is extremely important, and this has ramifications that extend far beyond the ratification of this Constitution, because these two organizations, not even organizations, but these two groups, the Federalists and the AntiFederalists, will lay the groundwork for America's first political party system in the 1790s, as we'll talk about in the last class of the semester. But nonetheless, in talking about this disagreement, we will see a lot of benefits, particularly the eventual inclusion of the Bill of Rights. But nonetheless, we're getting far ahead of ourselves, so let's turn to the ratification process itself. I want to begin with a point that I alluded to in the opening, and that is the fact that it was no certainty that this Constitution would be ratified. In fact, the victories for the nationalists during the Constitutional Convention meant that ratification would prove quite difficult. Supporters of the Constitution faced an uphill battle, given that most Americans were unlike those members, those delegates at the Constitutional Convention. Most Americans were common farmers with limited education, holding local perspectives, and possessing a deep distrust of centralized and distant government. Moreover, when the convention finished its work on September 17, 1787, not even all of the 55 delegates present approved of the document, which concerned those delegates supporting the Constitution. For example, Alexander Hamilton explained the following: "A few characters of consequence, by opposing or even refusing to sign the Constitution, might do an infinite mischief by kindling the latent sparks which lurk under an enthusiasm in favor of the convention which may soon subside." In short, what Hamilton was saying, and many of his Federalist nationalist allies agreed, we cannot let these critics of the Constitution speak this way out in public. Because if these leaders, these delegates, express doubts about the Constitution, these doubts will spread like a wildfire, and this Constitution will never be ratified. Well, on September 17th, 39 of the 42 delegates present at the convention signed the Constitution. What about those non-signers, as I described them? Well, they included, in particular, Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph, who was from Virginia, feared that it would harm Virginia's interests because it would give too many of the powers that Virginia currently possessed as a state, and the states were empowered by the Articles. It would give too many of these powers to the federal government. Meanwhile, fellow Virginian George Mason predicted that the strong centralized government would become either a monarchy or tyrannical aristocracy. Finally, the third non-signer, Elbridge Gerry, believed that the proposed government, and Gerry was from Massachusetts, by the way, Gerry believed that the proposed government was not strong enough to deal with the threat of democracy. Now, here's the thing. Despite these non-signers, there were other doubters, among them the leading nationalists. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and George Washington also had doubts, but they would sign it nonetheless. A leading Federalist, Hamilton, worried once again that what he called the people's what he called democratic jealousy would lead to opposition to the proposed Constitution. But nonetheless, the hope was that after one pillar after another arose in support of this Constitution. After one state after another rose in support of this Constitution, others would follow. And in fact, that is what you are eventually going to see throughout this process. Images like this one from the Massachusetts Sentinel, that would basically have a scorecard in their daily newspapers talking about how each state, one after the other, would ratify the Constitution. And as you can see the example on the right, Massachusetts being the latest in this example here. But nonetheless, a lot of people were holding their breaths as these columns went up, because they were wondering, would the Constitution in fact be ratified? And indeed, that was not a certainty. Despite, and maybe perhaps because of these concerns, there are certain features of the ratification process that tip the scales in favor of the Federalists. Now, one of the first and perhaps most important features of this ratification process is what we see at the image beneath, at the bottom of the screen. And that is the fact that the ratification would occur not in the state legislatures, but in special ratifying conventions. Ratification would be decided by special ratifying conventions rather than state legislatures, and this greatly benefited the Federalists. Mainly, the reason is, state legislatures were viewed as less likely to approve the Constitution because it would result in their losing power. Additionally, these ratifying conventions had to essentially give an up or down vote. Now, this basically meant that you didn't have to reach a threshold. You did not need 2/3 of the ratifying convention to get ratification. Rather, whoever had more yeses, whoever had less no's, the former would win, the latter would lose. So in short, it simply required an up or down vote. Additionally, besides this idea of ratifying conventions, for myriad reasons, the ratifying conventions themselves were made up of individuals who tended to tilt again the advantage in favor of the Federalists. Though Federalists were a minority in South Carolina, New York, and Rhode Island, the state ratifying conventions in these states actually had Federalist majorities. Therefore, you have to ask the question, how? How did these Federalists pack these state ratifying conventions in these very conservative places like South Carolina, New York, and Rhode Island? Well, this was essentially accomplished through gerrymandering, which resulted in the urban and coastal regions of these states being given higher representation in the conventions despite their smaller populations. And as we know from previous classes, a lot of these Federalists lived in these coastal and urban regions. For instance, we would also see another sort of chicanery and trickery, and that was the Federalists using more sinister methods. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, the Federalists actually called an election in Pennsylvania for the delegates before many people learned of the proposed Constitution itself, meaning that when the election took place in Pennsylvania to decide on these delegates for the state ratifying convention, only 13,000 of an eligible 70,000 people voted, with the majority of rural people, those who would likely oppose the Constitution, the majority of rural people missing out on that vote. Anti-Federalists attempted to stop what the Pennsylvania legislature was doing, and therefore from authorizing the state ratifying convention, but this required a quorum, meaning that all of them had to come together. So what the Federalists did was, they recruited tough guys to find and drag back anti-Federalists to the Assembly Hall to be present for the vote. Federalists enjoyed one other significant advantage, and that was the fact that this Constitution, in order for it to be ratified, it would only require 9 out of 13 states. This was unlike the Articles of Confederation, which at the beginning required unanimous consent for ratification, as well as for any amendments to it. But this is, again, not surprising, because after all, Rhode Island refused to even send delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Thus, when the Constitution was sent out, we would begin to see a split. We would see two groups when ratification first began in late 1787. And this division across America would lead to the creation of the Federalists and the AntiFederalists. I want to use this slide very briefly just to give you a sort of easy chart to see the differences in the faces of the Federalists and the AntiFederalists. So I'm going to repeat some of this stuff in later slides, but like I said, I wanted to give you an easy to find, easy to understand chart. The Federalists. The Federalists included such prominent individuals as George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. They were primarily of the upper classes. They were lawyers, they were merchants, and they were speculators. And they were mostly from urban areas. They believed that it was important to have a centralized and strong national government that should take providence over states. That the supreme law of the land was the national government, not the states. The Federalists, it's also important to note, had a strong publicity advantage. Being from urban areas, they had a ton of newspapers to print their arguments, and most notable of these was the Federalist Papers that we'll talk about a little later. Versus the Federalists were the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists included former revolutionaries like George Clinton of New York, Patrick Henry of Virginia, and Sam Adams of Massachusetts. These Anti-Federalists were primarily from rural areas and farmers. They believed that the power in any government should reside in the states, not the national government. They also were big on the Bill of Rights, as you'll see in at least one of the documents for this week. And in short, they believed that the nation should not be a huge republic with the seat of power in one location, but rather a nation of small sovereign republics. And what we see here on the image on the right is in fact America essentially being torn asunder. The image on the right, the individuals on the right, in the image on the right, represent the farmers, the Anti-Federalists. They are pulling the American wagon one way. On the left, we see the Federalists. They are pulling the wagon another way. And as we can see, this is essentially tearing the nation apart. But we also see two things beneath that. We see the two different divides, if you will, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalist farmers, and beneath them, the merchants, the traders on the seas. So which direction will America go? Obviously, that is very uncertain at this point, as we've talked about in previous slides. We're going to begin this story by talking about the Anti-Federalists. And the individual at the center of the screen in front of the desk on the right is Patrick Henry. He would be one of the leading Anti-Federalists. And the reason why is because of his fame that he achieved during the Revolutionary War. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. He proclaimed some of those similar arguments now, but the enemy is no longer Great Britain. It is now this possible central government that may exist under the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, that were led by people like Patrick Henry, among others, saw the Revolutionary War as having been fought to allow for the creation of independent Republican state governments. For them, the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, was solely an instrument controlled by the 13 individual state republics. They believed that in its original structure, that it was ideal for what they considered the preservation of republicanism. The reason they felt this was because the Articles of Confederation gave all states equal power and also allowed every state to basically determine its own fortunes and not give up their powers without unanimous consent. These Anti-Federalists believed that to protect liberty, government power needed to be limited to the absolute minimum necessity. And this, again, is what we saw in the Articles. You had one unicameral legislature, and that was it. And therefore, the states were able to very much dominate this system of governments under the Articles of Confederation. Any centralized power, the Anti-Federalists argued, any centralized power threatened to destroy Republican government and replace it with an aristocracy or monarchy. Anti-Federalists claim that granting the central government sovereign powers, including the right to taxation, would inevitably be used to strengthen centralization, including possibly the creation of a peacetime standing army. In the minds of Anti-Federalists, these two issues were directly related to one another: taxation and standing army. In fact, Richard Henry Lee, another prominent Virginian, another prominent Anti-Federalist, wrote the following: "Forgive the purse, and the sword will follow. Forgive the purse again to the central government, and the sword will follow." For Anti-Federalists, a standing army represented the death of freedom. Anti-Federalists believed that it was human nature to seek and abuse power. Therefore, they would oppose this Constitution, which would give too much power to very few individuals at the center of power. So, as I've already alluded to in the previous breakdown that distinguished Federalists from Anti-Federalists, Anti-Federalists were the most prolific and most common in the rural backcountry. Governor Morris, an ardent nationalist and Federalist, as well as being a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, recognized as much when he wrote of his opponents in a letter to George Washington. Here we can see Governor Morris saying the following: "I dread the cold and sour temper of the back counties." Here he is referring to that Anti-Federalist sentiment that he deplores. Nonetheless, rather than accept the Federalist idea of a large republic administered by a small elite, the Anti-Federalists defended the ideal of a confederation of small republics in which republican liberty and popular participation were the defining features of political life. Anti-Federalists opposed various features of the Constitution, believing that it proposed a far too centralized government led by an aloof aristocracy. These Anti-Federalists worried that people could directly elect only their congressmen, since state legislators would choose senators and an electoral college would select the president. This was very much done on purpose. If you remember, this was an anti-democratic constitutional convention, as I talked about in the last lecture, where they were worried about this populism. So it's not surprising that these populist Anti-Federalists would oppose these measures that were put in place in the Constitutional Convention. Additionally, besides the fact of choosing state legislatures, or the ability of state legislators to choose senators, and the Electoral College using its powers to choose the president, the Anti-Federalists were also concerned that the president could appoint judges for life who could review and reject state laws. So in short, we see the Anti-Federalists being very much critical of this, what they called an aristocratic constitution. Anti-Federalists were also concerned about the terms of these politicians. If you look at what the Anti-Federalists were writing during this time, they much preferred terms of 1 year, and were in fact opposed to politicians running indefinitely for re-election. In terms of representation, the Anti-Federalists believed that more representatives were needed so that they could more easily and capably speak for more people. Anti-Federalists argue that true congressional representation required the legislators to actually resemble their constituents. They didn't want them to be these aloof aristocrats living in their laps of luxury while they're making decisions for the poor and common, everyday, ordinary American. In short, we see the Anti-Federalists preferring populist democracy and localism. Theirs was a vision of a populist democracy and localism. From their perspective, the legislature should and ought to be an exact mirror of society. Federalists, these Anti-Federalists, believe that smaller congressional districts would actually bring out the best in people. But the Federalists disagreed, so that was not in the Constitution. what I want to end with in talking about the Anti-Federalists is that in terms of the protection of liberties, the Anti-Federalists sought a Bill of Rights. At a minimum, they said if we are going to have this aristocratic government with elites ruling everything, we need to ensure that protection is accorded to the people. And that would be done through a Bill of Rights. But nonetheless, I do want to mention this one point, because this fear of elitism and aloofness and domination by the rich and wealthy was a very big fear among these populist anti-federalists, so much so that if we look at a study of 80 anti-federalist attacks on the Constitution or its supporters in the Pennsylvania press from September 26 to December 26 of 1787, this study would find that aristocracy was used in 49% of all attacks, well-born was used in 35% of all attacks, and great names was used in 23% of all attacks. In short, these critics believed that the Constitution would create an aristocracy controlled by the well-born and the great men. Again, the Federalists were essentially the nationalists that we talked about during the making of the Constitution. George Washington led this nationalist camp, which also included Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, but also many of the generals and Confederation officials of old, including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Federalists found their greatest support among the nation's lawyers, merchants, and speculators. The Federalists also had some of the best thinkers in the game on their side, including three of them, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who in 1787 and 1788 would write 85 essays that were eventually combined in the Federalist, which later became known as the Federalist Papers. These Federalists supported Republican popular government, but wanted a government stronger than the Confederation, which they blamed on prolonging the Revolutionary War and making it more costly. As early as 1783, Washington was calling for an empowered Congress. We can see the quotes here on the screen. He said in one letter, "No man in the United States is or can be more deeply impressed with the necessity of a reform in our present Confederation than myself. For to the defects thereof and want of powers in Congress may justly be ascribed the prolongation of the war and consequently the expenses occasioned by it." Later in that same year, George Washington would say in another letter, "Certain I am that unless adequate powers are given to Congress for the general purposes of the Federal Union, that we shall soon molder into dust and become contemptible in the eyes of Europe before sinking into obscurity." In short, already, even far earlier than other Federalists, George Washington would say, give Congress power, and if you do not empower Congress, this nation will suffer and perish and disappear. For the Federalists, the Confederation was wholly inadequate because it lacked the ability to enforce its decisions over state opposition, which prevented a truly national state. Federalists were not concerned, very much unlike the Anti-Federalists, Federalists were not concerned with the threat to Republican liberty posed by a more expansive, centralized government. Federalists pointed, in fact, to the various checks on government officials, most notably the ability of Americans to remove elected officials from office if they acted contrary to the will of the people. As these two sides fought and battled over the outcome of this Constitution, we see a pretty quick move towards ratification. In fact, 7 states had voted to ratify already by early 1788. Remember, only 9 states are required to ratify it completely. But here's the thing. No other states would do so between February 6th and April 26th in 1788. So what had appeared like an all but certainty now began to drag on, and some people began to question. But nonetheless, by June 21st, 1788, we would see New Hampshire become the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. Well, in doing so, it actually jumped in front of 2 other states that were believing that they believed themselves they would likely be the last state to ratify, so they took it slow in this debate. And those 2 states were the large and important New York and Virginia. I want to talk briefly about Virginia. The tide turned in Virginia largely due to the arguments presented by James Madison in his debate with Patrick Henry. Furthermore, the state's governor, Virginia's Governor Edmund Randolph, was also offered a cabinet position in the new government, so therefore eventually Virginia would ratify the Constitution. New York as well would follow suit, encouraged by a threat by delegates from New York City, which is where the state earned most of its revenue from, the ports, and the threat was that it would secede from the state to join the Union. In the end, only Rhode Island and North Carolina rejected the Constitution. Yet, this was no easy journey, this ratification process, even though it happened relatively quick. You can see the numbers on the screen. Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, the Constitution received an average of 53% of the delegates' vote in favor of ratification. So just over the 50% threshold in 3 of the biggest states and most important in terms of reputation and influence. We can see the numbers on the screen. Massachusetts, 187 to 168 in favor. Virginia, 89 to 79 in favor. New York, the closest, 30 to 27. In short, what we are seeing is a still very much divided country, even though ratification happened. But I want to also show something else here, because as you can see, the support for ratification followed the lines that we've been talking about. Support for ratification was most prominent along the coastline and in urban areas across these states, whereas in the backcountry rural areas is where the majority were against ratification. At the end of the day, national elections would now take place in early 1789. As it turned out, the Anti-Federalists decided that they were going to sit this out. Anti-Federalist politicians and voters stayed home, allowing the Federalists to capture 48 out of the 59 seats in the House of Representatives. George Washington, for his part, was chosen as president. His vice president was John Adams. Now here's the interesting thing, and we're going to come back to these 2 individuals at the end of the semester. As his Secretary of the Treasury, George Washington would select the ardent Federalist Alexander Hamilton. As his Secretary of State, George Washington would select the ardent he wasn't so much an anti-Federalist, but he was a lukewarm Federalist, and that was Thomas Jefferson. We'll talk about some of the problems that leads to later in the semester. As you'll see in some of the documents for this week, the biggest criticism of the Constitution, particularly in Virginia, was over the fear that a centralized government would take over people's liberty, and therefore a Bill of Rights was necessary. After the Constitutional Convention ended in September 1787, James Madison sent a copy of this Constitution to his good friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson at this point was in Paris serving as America's minister to France. Jefferson approved of the document, but he immediately noted a glaring omission. He said the following: "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference." Madison, for his part, James Madison, did not feel that these rights needed to be stated since the government was limited to specific enumerated powers and nothing more. Nonetheless, Madison, as a leader in the House of Representatives, pushed through the Bill of Rights, which were not known as such until the 1860s. Still, he rejected, did Madison, several other amendments proposed by the Anti-Federalists, which included amendments to restrict the federal government's powers to levy taxes, keep an army in peacetime, and establish a federal judiciary. James Madison would have none of that. Nonetheless, 10 amendments were made to the Constitution, and these became known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, the acceptance and approval of the Bill of Rights, led to North Carolina's entrance into the Union in November 1789. Rhode Island, for its part, remained indignant until Congress in 1790 threatened to bar trade between the United States and Rhode Island, and therefore in 1790, Rhode Island would become the 13th state in the Union.